our speaker, his internet went down and he couldn't send me anything. And so we ended up on the telephone for 45 minutes one afternoon, dictating. He was reading to me important points for the press release. And it was a blast getting to know John over the phone, and it's been a blast getting to know John this evening. And I'm sure you will feel the same way. John Anderson joined Sandia Corporation as a mechanical engineer early in 1955, and within 2 weeks volunteered for Operation Teapot in Nevada. That was pretty much starting a career with a bang. In fact, fairly close in to some fairly large detonations as a microbarograph operator. He returned to Albuquerque and soon began working with Los Alamos on the W-25 MB-1 Nuclear Air Defense Emergency Capability Project. A 50-year-plus career ensued, including many projects with people on the Hill. This was supplemented by being called to a 2-year active duty stint with the Army Engineers as a combat engineer, atomic demolitions munitions officer. Anderson is from Miami, Florida, where during World War II, ship sinkings caused by U-boats were often sighted from the beach and where blackouts were enforced. He attended Davidson College in North Carolina, and I need to interrupt. This is his introduction. Is anyone familiar with Davidson College? Raise your hand. Okay, well, they just made it into the NCAA tournament again, so congratulations, John and Davidson. He was telling me that, oh, you've never heard of this school. Oh, yes, I have. So John attended Davidson College in North Carolina and graduated from engineering at the University of Florida. He worked at the Savannah River plant in South Carolina and at Convair Fort Worth before joining Sandia Corporation. He attended 4 graduate schools at UNM and summer courses at UCLA, Dartmouth, and University of Pennsylvania. He served as an adjunct professor of mechanical engineering at UNM, specializing in engineering design. He was in the first group of distinguished member of the technical staff at Sandia and was the manager of Phase 1 and 2 systems, which were the concept and feasibility stages for new nuclear weapons developments, requiring close coordination with Los Alamos. He also had extensive experience in safeguards and nuclear transportation. He submitted Sandia's first patent application in solar energy and worked on reactor siting. His other patents are in the fields of reentry vehicles and safe plutonium containers for air transport. For 2 years, he served on the staff of the United States Nuclear Command and Control System Support Staff, the NSS, in Washington, D.C. Augmenting the years at Sandia, Anderson served the American Society of Mechanical Engineers in local, state, national, and international positions, including governor, and was awarded the Dedicated Service Award. He is a life fellow of ASME. Anderson's wife, Elaine Reitel, a retired teacher, grew up in Los Alamos, where her father was a physicist in the detonator group. He has 3 grown children, a zoologist with the Oregon Zoo, an airline captain with Alaska Airlines and GE Aviation, and a rock musician who is a services manager at UNM Health Sciences Center. He enjoys being a docent at the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History in Albuquerque, travel, presentations, home design and construction, and sailing, flying small planes, and N-scale model railroading. Everyone, give a big round of applause for John Anderson.
Konnichiwa. Konbaiwa. Hello. Good evening. Thank you very much, Todd. Thank you very much, Heather. I can't overemphasize what an honor this is to have risen from just sitting here eating lunch in this room many years ago to being able to have the privilege of speaking here tonight. And I do not have the knowledge of this subject or the breadth of it that some of you here in attendance indeed have. I'll do my best, and maybe I'll make up for it by trying to be brief. At dinner, I was asked what led me to this interest, to go to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When I was 12 years old, I was put on a rickety steam engine train. I was right away made head of the group of unruly kids, ended up in North Carolina at a YMCA camp. The morning I turned age 13, August 7, 1945, the camp director told the assembly of young boys that an atomic bomb had been detonated by the United States over Japan. I didn't know what that meant. A scant 3 days later, on August 10th, 1945, at the similar morning assembly, this camp director told us that the United States had dropped a second bomb on Japan and that maybe the war would end soon. My father had been gone in the war for years. I didn't know where he was. Turns out he was in the Philippines, imminent of his ship embarking on the invasion of Japan. So that led unexpectedly to 10 years later, myself standing in front of devices designed and developed here at this magnificent laboratory. And I was in a minor role of standing in front of them and measuring their blast effect. Well, we better quickly switch to the subject, going from that very early experience here on the Hill and with the incredible people I worked with through many, many, many years here at Los Alamos. All of you know this part of the story very well, and I mentioned it already. I don't need to repeat those things. At the drop zone, the remaining ruin is called the A-bomb Dome, and a number of you I know have visited there. It came out of a Czech architect in the year 1915, as I say here in my script, as the result of an international competition to show off the merchandise and product of this prefecture of Japan. It had a steel arched dome and masonry walls, and obviously one of the few surviving buildings of the nuclear detonation. Before and after, the upper left black and white, lower right black and white are obviously archival. The other two are my pictures. I do not know what this monument is, the upper right picture. Sort of reminded me of Stonehenge, but some Japanese memorial inside the fenced-off portion of this preserved building. Lower left, very typical. It's my shot later in the day of the visit. The surrounding infrastructure of modern buildings and modern civilization. The Peace Park itself consists of many memorials and statues. Here you see emblems of young children and older people. A Japanese tourist boat coming underneath the bridge, the famous T-shaped bridge, which I'll go back into. To the right, upper and lower, is the flame for peace. It is not an eternal flame. That flame is intended to be extinguished when there are no more nuclear weapons on Earth. What seems like sawed through bridge sections is the sculptor's representation of two outstretched hands in a prayer or beseeching for peace. The center point of the park, that arch-like cenotaph, in some architect's mind resembled a Japanese dwelling. And inside it is a tomb or vault with perhaps now, at the time of my visit, 270,000 names associated with the deaths or later deaths of people. And there's a whole system in Japan for submitting your nominees to get in there. The Peace Fountain is shown here. You see a bower of flowers in front of the cenotaph.
Excuse me, John, you're blocking the screen. Thank you.
Thank you for telling me. One of the memorials is in honor of students killed there. Now in Japan, in August of 1945, young people below the age of 13 were conscripted to build fire breaks about 100 meters wide through every city in Japan because Curtis LeMay and our B-29 fleet were doing incendiary bombing of Japan, which indeed killed more people than the two nuclear blasts. There's a large memorial to Koreans. Japan had enslaved the nation of Korea, and tens of thousands of Koreans under very primitive conditions were doing all types of manual labor in every Japanese city. So many young children, thousands of them, and many Koreans, thousands of them, died at the instant of the blast of the little boy weapon. I noticed that a few steps from Fuller Lodge, there's an origami place. The upper right picture is the monument to the girl who eventually died of leukemia, but who thought that the folding of origami paper cranes would be a source of making peace worldwide. And I'm seeking here in my notes that girl's name. Sorry, I better not spend the time, not enough light here. So the memorials present the Japanese feeling about many different groups of people. Lower left picture, I'll try to get back out. You see from a vantage point that I had up in the museum hallway, looking back down to the Sentotoff, you see a large group of very formal clad Japanese people. They come in orderly progressions throughout the day, uniformed school children on up to very formally dressed older people, paying their obeisance, their memorial feelings. I stood in line between groups. I was allowed to stand in front of the Sentotoff. I got another American tourist or somebody to snap my picture, and you see how they deliver fresh flowers just constantly here at the memorial. A view of the museum, the lower picture here, the two-story structure, is an extended corridor of the museum, and the content of that I'll get to in a few minutes. And in the distance, the near distance, is the historical museum itself. The buildings behind are just the usual high-rise modern Japanese buildings. Of particular note, and I've been asked this by other people, what languages do they present this in? They present it in Japanese and English. So every beautiful engraved stone, as you can see here, is in their language or in ours. Inside the Atomic Museum, they deal with the historic finding by Lisa Meitner, lower left picture, that in exile in Sweden, she confirmed to Otto Hahn and Otto Frisch, her scientific partners in the lab back in Germany, which she had to flee. She was the second woman ever to gain the PhD in physics at the University of Vienna, was working on atomic energy for the Nazi regime, had to flee Germany or she would have been executed because she was Jewish. On a cross-country skiing and snowshoeing expedition in Sweden, where she had gone in exile, Frisch and Hahn came over to tell her about the results, these astounding results of irradiating some raw uranium with electrons, and they were left some barium and some other stuff, and they measured a lot of energy. She said, wait a minute, don't tell me. Lisa got out pencil and paper from her backpack, and in quantum mechanics calculations, calculated by hand, you either got this much energy, this much, or this much, and I think it was this much, and they said that's exactly what she measured, that we measured. She later got the Nobel Prize years after they did. So she defined that the atom had been split. Upper right picture, very familiar to Szilard, the on-again, off-again Hungarian, who had conceived of nuclear chain reactions mentally and was afraid to tell anybody. And he finally convinced Einstein on the third time to write a letter to Roosevelt, which did result in some funding that built CP1, Chicago Pile 1, the money going for the pure uranium, for the uranium ore and the pure graphite blocks. Well, then came Pearl Harbor, the lower right picture, and things really moved out and became a great part of your history here. Churchill and Roosevelt discussing these things. Jumping around a little bit quick, how come Hiroshima? And again, these are all pictures of their posters and their presentations. And you know it was a default of faults in that B-29, in spite of it being a very special silver plate B-29, redeveloped from the Boeing design by Colonel Paul Tibbets and made into a much better airplane to be entrusted with this national, irreplaceable asset, the little boy. And they were having fuel transfer problems and range problems and weather problems. They had a bunch of protocols to follow besides radar sighting. They had to have visual sighting. And the target was the famous T-shaped bridge in Hiroshima, which I'll get to. So those factors, just if there's such a thing as coincidence in life, those factors in life caused Hiroshima to be first. The Japanese people had become very accustomed to single B-29s dropping this harmless lump, got nicknamed Pumpkin, and having these other small devices also dropping along with it on small parachutes, radiosondes. And this was all to practice the actual mission where the radiosondes would be receiving measurements of radiation, blast, and thermal. They got to where they weren't even sounding the air raid alarms with that type of mission going overhead. They have a very accurate looking little boy hanging there in the museum. A sharp eye might detect these protruding antennae at quadrants around the bomb. Those are Yagi antennas. Professor Yagi, a chair of electrical engineering at Harvard University, had invented antennas, and the Japanese patents were public to the world, and the engineers preceding you, I think, maybe some of you are old enough to have been that engineer, here at Los Alamos used the Yagi patents for the height of burst fusing on both Little Boy and Fat Man. So that's an irony of war. Japanese radar antennas being used against a Japanese target. They can show a cutaway of Little Boy, whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent. Neither you nor I will be able to comment on. We can't do that in our museum in Albuquerque. We can't show a cutaway of a weapon. Okay, over the target was that well-known T-shaped bridge. And that's a real good visual target for a bombardier. So here you see the main road, and I rode the trolley to the middle of that bridge, and then the stem that goes over to this peninsula of land. So that was supposed to be ground zero. Actual ground zero over here was about 500 meters off. Really very, very good for the Norden bomb site and the high altitude dropping in 1945. The ground directly under ground zero happened to be a hospital. The A-bomb dome is about here and on the other side of this river from the dedicated Peace Park. And I have to look at my notes. The river, let's see, to your left is the Honkawa River, and the river to your right is the Motoyasu River. At their museum, the red ball represents the nuclear burst over its precise spot, and the models there in the museum represent the before and after. they may have thought that building codes and the demand for land use in Japan might finally have taken down the old A-bomb dome, 1915 building. So they built a one-for-one replica of it inside their museum. So you see the A-bomb dome outdoors and indoors. They show the horrors of thermal and fires. They have the actual child's tricycle, which we have a photograph of in our nuclear museum in Albuquerque. And they have thousands of artifacts carefully documented and nomenclated and laid out in archival style. The shadow, which is hard to see in this, is one of the famous sights, the shadow of a kneeling human caught just at the instant of detonation, and his body shielded the stone from the effects of heat. In another view there of the city, only a masonry chimney remains erect. And this picture of the trolley car crew out on day 3, it was documented that they all died of radiation illness, but the Japanese were there that quickly, rebuilding, and I literally rode those same trolley rails all these years later. From a recording of the event as it happened upon them, they then launch out into a tutorial about nuclear weapons. And this then segues from their Artifact and History Museum into their Peace Institute. And I showed you one picture of the long 2-story building, the museum at one end, and you go back through that second story, it is the information about today's nuclear weapons. And then it terminates in a large institute for peace where they conduct many worldwide meetings. So here on a poster, they were explaining in one poster fission and fusion, single stage and 2-stage weapons, and then prominently showing our large yield underwater test shortly after World War II at Bikini. They have an annual updating of all nuclear weapons stockpiles worldwide. They have a model of a globe, and I may be misoriented, somebody please correct me, maybe a Chinese ICBM field and maybe an India-Pakistan concept of ICBMs, and here's another grouping in China. And they keep a map going, color-coded and quantitative, of which nations possess nuclear weapons and how many weapons they believe that to be. These 3 views happen to show U.S. nuclear capabilities, air carriage from an F-16, undersea launch from a sea-launched ballistic missile, and a cruise missile, such as the Alcom, or with a Los Alamos W-80 warhead in it. Here's a view of a picture, not that I took literally, but I took this of a picture, showing one of their annual peace congregations out there on the plaza of the park at the cenotaph, and everybody in this incredibly formal and respectful clothing. So it's a very big event with them. Moving away then from that triangle of land formed by the 2 rivers and going across that one river over to the hypocenter, and that is their terminology for the point on ground underneath ground zero, the hypocenter. Its main industry now is condos, parking garages, and cemeteries. And at ground zero, the monument is this thing that looks like a newspaper sale stand. Here it is a little bit bigger. And yes, it was always raining. And it's just a very ordinary Japanese street of commerce. Within that building at the Hypo Center is a cemetery according to their customs and beliefs, and then just one narrow fence from all those tombstones. They were selling parking places, or you could go up into your condo. So it's a remarkable recovery. I'm going through this fast and not nearly in the depth of expertise that a number of you possess. I'm going to try to cover both cities and both parks and still finish on time. This is just personal. The cover of the Japan Rail Pass, which is how I traveled, is that famous artist's presentation of an epic tsunami. Little did I know that after my visit, Fukushima Daiichi would happen, and the root cause of that was improper siting, both by commercial pushing from General Electric America to sell boiling water reactors, and by an acquiescence of Japanese nuclear ministry to accept nuclear power. And it was knowingly sited on a severe, very severe earthquake fault. And there were historic markers of tsunamis of incredible heights that were ignored. So just interesting, back then the tsunami was their rail pass cover, and that literal rail pass is here on the table. My son's an airline captain. He flies for Alaska, that airplane back there, and he got me a 10% cost ticket, which is another reason how I came to go. And I typically rode the second class of Shinkansen trains, which were simply the 180-mile-an-hour trains with luxury seats. And a class higher than that is bedroom cars with a steward and food on board. I was very satisfied with this class of bullet train. And then I'll get to a different class of train when I get to Nagasaki. When I arrived in Hiroshima, I didn't have a hotel room, but I had studied from the internet, and I walked to the railroad station hotel, which exceeds any hotel I've been in America. It's absolutely 5-star, and they were out of rooms. And while I struggled with translation and a room clerk, this is after midnight, suddenly a room appeared for me, so I got to stay there. And then the next day early, I walked underneath the railroad station to get to my first intended hotel. And I don't know why, but it's called the Grand Intelligent Hotel, and it's totally British, Old English. I don't know why. And I certainly enjoyed Japanese comfort. Their toilet system is wonderful. You dial in male or female, you dial in water temperature and water pressure, and what your objective is in a simple sign language, and it is indeed very comforting. I have a segue now to find Nagasaki on this computer. I've got to be able to see. I've got to get the file.
Right here. Go down here.
Okay, I'll let you. Thank you. Questions or comments up to this point? I'm sorry if I'm blocking your view from over there. I try to move about. Some of you know a good deal more about this than I do, and I'm also trying to be conserving of our bedtime tonight. And so, having given that view of Hiroshima, resuming on the train, going to the absolute end of the line, Nagasaki. There were bumpers in the train station. The train can't go any further. And again, I was freelancing. I had no accommodations. All of you know this fact extremely well. So the next B-29 strike, the boxcar, not flown by Colonel Bach, named for him, but flown by another man that day. And this picture, for all I know, might even have been taken by Harold Agnew from within the airplane or the chase plane. They again had difficulties with the B-29s and the weather and the proof of acquisition of target, not just by radar, but also visually. The cartooning on Boxcar shows their saga from Salt Lake City to Nagasaki. It was named for Bok, B-O-C-K, the aircraft commander up until that day. So here you see the flying Boxcar. And festooned about within the nose are the pumpkin drops and the little radiosondes that accompanied that for instrumentation. So upper left picture is archival, not my photography. Lower right picture is my photography in the museum. I do not know what those clay pots, it sort of reminded me of New Mexico. I don't know what the pots were at the foreground. And then behind the glass, they have this diorama of their destruction. Again, I got there by a local trolley, having been a resident in the Nagasaki Bus Terminal Hotel, where the tourist agency decided my budget would fit their requirements. So venturing across the town and walk a few blocks from the trolley stop and go up this magnificent staircase, beautiful flowers as you can see, and I was drenched by the fountain of peace because the wind was blowing. And you walk on down the park, and the focal point is this 30-meter story high sculpture, the result of a Japanese art competition. I show you a fellow tourist in front, and then the bower of flowers omnipresent, and then the great statue. And what's represented here is that the humanoid, the left hand is pointing to ground zero, literally, and I'll take you there. And some people say it's pointing to the baseness of man or warfare. Right hand extended up to their belief in a higher being. One leg folded in the position of contemplation and peace. The other leg extended, ready to take action on behalf of those oppressed by war. Again, the visiting groups of Japanese, just in seemingly seamless tours, many tour buses parked along the periphery of the park, and great respect for the elders and largely elderly people and school children, sort of that division. I'd have to go to my notes a moment. The tourist pamphlet I picked up and Wikipedia say that there are just 15 statues there. There were many more at Hiroshima. And I thought there were more than 15, and each of these has its meaning. The one from the United States of America is from St. Paul, Minnesota, one of the sister cities to Nagasaki. And the Japanese, in English translation, call it the totem pole, but the citizens of St. Paul who funded it call it the Earth constellation. And I haven't been able to resolve that opinion of its appearance. Some of their monuments here are to their young children who were there making fire breaks. Once you reached age 13, the day I heard about the atomic bomb, once you reached age 13, you were in a munitions factory. Because by the time you were 17, you were out at Iwo Jima or Okinawa or wherever fighting the world. And then they too had many Korean victims. And they say at their museum that 74,000 were killed in the blast and 75,000 injured. And that is a 1945 count by their accounting. One of the famous things destructed here was the Hiroshima Cathedral, the largest Roman Catholic cathedral in all of Asia. And it was destroyed essentially in this blast. Just different views. I apologize for my blocking. Different views of the Japanese people, and then your crass American tourist having his picture taken there. Their old museum became an unsafe building and is fenced off and is in the process of, or is, a National Historic Building. And the new museum is an absolutely magnificent building. So here you see the entrance. The red brick building in the background is the Japanese Museum of Folklore. Reminds me of the Alexander Girard Museum in Santa Fe. Maybe it's somewhat similar. Inside the museum, you come in under a dome, and you go down a circular staircase, the opposite of the Guggenheim on Fifth Avenue, New York City, and you're surrounded by water just on the other side of glass as cascading waterfalls go down. And the museum experience itself starts in the basement. I, of course, was looking for a cognition at both Hiroshima and Nagasaki of Japanese culpability. How did this come about to be wrought upon them by the incredible breakthroughs and genius from this place where I am standing now? And this was as much of an admission as I found in Nagasaki. Years earlier, reviews would say that they were extremely one-sided. Nancy, my dinner companion this evening, points out that both Hiroshima and Nagasaki are city museums, not national level. So they say their experience, what their city endured. And the text here, I intentionally took as sharp a picture as I could for you to read how they sort of admit to trying to conquer a good part of the world, the part of the world that Adolf Hitler was not trying to conquer. So there's some admission. The Fat Man over Nagasaki detonated within a valley as intended, and the blast effect and thermal radiation went up and down the valley, so the nearby hillsides protected nearby adjacent populations. In both cities, we did destroy some ordnance and munition plants, whether by intent or by accident, but that did happen. They show Fat Man a little bit slimmed up, a little bit on a diet. A cutaway again, which I can't comment on, nor can many of you. And then I saw, as Nancy said over dinner, groups of school children coming in with their tablets and their assignments and grouping here at this table to fill out an assignment right underneath the nose of the Fat Man. And there they are doing that. They have I guess, a scientific explanation of the Fat Man and the creation of implosion design and lensing. And quite a few details here again, as was true with the little boy in Hiroshima. They give you a timeline in this one picture from 37 to 44, the different great events. They also have some interactive video and a timeline screen. Here you see General Groves, here you see Eisenhower and Stalin and other figures well known to you. They do a pretty good job, I think, from trying to be in their perspective of how this happened, both the unfolding of the terror of World War and also what happened emanating from this hallowed ground, if I may call it that. Upper left picture is the atomic cannon we have in the backyard at the Nuclear Museum in Albuquerque. Soviet thermonuclear weapon, an obvious copy of the TX-17. B-52 bomber in the old days when we called them oil burners. They now have an improved engine that doesn't leave as much black smoke, but we still use 80 of them as an active atomic weapon capable bomber. Various Russian and Chinese and American weapons being tracked, and they keep quite a log on it. Here's a TLAM-N, or Tomahawk, well known to some people at Los Alamos, and firing it from the deck of an American battleship, as can be done. And then they go through a litany of the sins within America, state by state. And we are very well singled out. This is their vision of a Pueblo Indian. This is their vision of a New Mexico uranium mine. And we have victimized the Native Americans by enslaving them in our uranium mines. And they tell you that story. This is one image in a series of them. I think New Mexico is this one right here, singled out here. So we are part of the group of villains. And they also show how we have destroyed the United States of America through nuclear detonations. I stood in front of many of them in Nevada. Hundreds and hundreds of Los Alamos devices were detonated in the atmosphere there. And I think Nevada is still thriving. And then they show some off-site bursts. That might be Rifle, Colorado. That might be Hattiesburg, Mississippi. For those of you who know the shot at Hattiesburg, Mississippi, it was about 385 tons insult and fully contained. But they're showing how we've victimized our own people. They're much stronger about this in Nagasaki than they were in Hiroshima. And then they're tracking the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and I've worked on that at the IAEA in Los Alamos, in Vienna. They then go into Lawrence Livermore and Los Alamos National Lab subcritical plutonium tests underground in Nevada, and then in an unexpected sequence they're explaining GPS systems, but in your car. The inference was being that nuclear weapons can be targeted accurately using GPS. The Nagasaki being very hilly, a lot of ravines, sort of like Los Alamos. The hypocenter is a walk away from that Peace Park with that great Shinto statue. The stone obelisk there houses their cenotaph with memorialized names. Early on microfilm, I don't know what media they're on now. And again, I found an obliging tourist from Finland to take my picture there at the Hypo Center. Going back downtown, here's the train I arrived on, and I got to get my picture taken in front of it because it couldn't go forward anymore, end of the line. Took this picture from an overwalk at the rail station, from which I was guided to stay in the Nagasaki bus terminal hotel. Very, very satisfactory. Not origami, but the tradition of that form of Japanese art, and just a view of the city as it looks today. I'm at a segue now. Questions or comments? Either Hiroshima or Nagasaki, or the way I'm trying to condense the story. And I am on time. Well, as a treat to myself, I asked the manager in the Nagasaki bus terminal hotel how I might get, I knew how to get there, where I might stay in Kyoto, and he looked it up for 20, 30 minutes. Everything's sold out. You cannot go to Kyoto. And you know, if they say that at Los Alamos, well, you stay in Santa Fe or Espanola. So I said, well, I'll just stay in Osaka. That stunned him. 14-minute train ride. I got a rail pass, so I can go back and forth anytime I want. 14 minutes away. No one approaching them had ever thought they could visit Kyoto, even though there were no rooms left in Kyoto. And so I did. And that was another experience, to be in a just totally industrial modern city, and a different story of cab drivers and this and that. Well, one of the famous sites, as you know, is the Golden Pavilion. And I don't have my Japanese ancestry memorized as to what kingdom and which emperor this was, but they have the gold. The second and third story is real gold foil, just like you see rubbed onto Buddhas all over the Orient. They rub the gold foil on it. And then the first floor is the black and white plaster and wood beam architecture. And just my own views, again, I'm sorry I walked back and forth on you, of this same stunning place. And incredibly crowded. And you wait your turn to get up to the wooden railing to get your own undisturbed picture in a very polite progression. Thousands of school children, and you know, I was a foot or two taller than everybody else. Nobody paid me disrespect, or there was no singling out. Very, very polite, very orderly in all situations, on streetcars, on trains. No street crime. I was walking around at 2 or 3 in the morning to get to where I wanted to go. There's just no fear. Some American presidents have been to the Imperial Palace in Kyoto. Now you'll notice the beam across the bottom of all doorways. If I get my laser, well, anyway, you see a black beam across the bottom of the doorway. And that's because evil spirits, which are going to invade your palace or your home, they can't climb up. So that beam keeps the evil spirit outside. You learn all these little things. Beautiful art and architecture throughout. Of great interest are the Japanese gardens. I hope you have visited the very nice Japanese garden in the Albuquerque Biopark. And it's a good replica. And here are the Japanese gardens outside of the Imperial Palace. Try to stay out of your way. I should have a remote on this. Beautiful use of water and vegetation. Then I decided not to use the subway system to get back to the train station to go on to Osaka, and instead walk in the rain. And one mission I had was to buy kimonos for the ladies in my family, and I was just treated elegantly in a kimono shop. Another thing, I have a rock musician's son. One department store had an entire floor of nothing but guitars. And then using my map, I discovered where I was. I was in front of another great imperial palace, but it is Founders Hall. It was the first building built by the Japanese emperors for the people. You'll have to tell me louder. But I got to move forward. And that's a front view of it. And you see it is encroached upon by modern skyscrapers. But it was the first building of an imperial palace nature where the common man could go. Inklings of democracy, circa 1200 BC. No, AD. And then again, the same signature goodbye, giving credit to my son for being. And here's a final shot. I'm inside the train station department store 5-star hotel in Kyoto, and wending my way through the $50 per cocktail white tablecloths and getting over to the railing. I take this wide-angle picture. Train station below, department store and hotel levels in the middle, and what's on top, at the top of 5 cascades of escalators and back out under the night sky, they're putting up a Christmas tree. do not discount their commercialism. Questions or comments?
Questions?
Was visiting Hiroshima and Nagasaki the purpose of your trip? That's why you went, or were you just over there for another reason?
It was the singular purpose, and I try to weave that into a little bit of a life story. I heard about these in boys' camp, and 10 years later stood in front of them, and now, before I can't go places anymore, I wanted to go there and see what their present presentation, atmosphere, attitude, what little you can learn in a fast visit. No, Kyoto just happened. I got ahead of my schedule. No, I was there not for Tokyo or anything else, not for Mount Fuji. I was there just for Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
In Hiroshima, was there any acknowledgement of the Americans? There were several PODs who were, quite a few who were slave laborers in Hiroshima killed.
Yes, the question was, do they memorialize any of the Americans killed there? And I did have that in my notes. The answer is absolutely yes, they do. It is not prominent, as you might expect. And yes, one of the many inscriptions or minor monuments do recognize the American POWs who were killed in the blast.
When you were there, were there people there who knew who you were, knew something about your background? They knew you were Anglo, obviously, but did they know anything about your background?
Very interesting question. I worried about that a little bit, not enough to keep me from going. No, I encountered no docents, no guides, picked up a little bit of literature, which I show on this table over here, and any discussion toward a technical nature or toward an ethical or moral nature were just engaged with other English-speaking tourists from throughout the world. I was looking for that sort of contact. I did not experience it. Sir, ma'am. Hi.
John?
Ma'am. Oh, lady?
Yes. Did either museum mention the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Absolutely. I know I flashed my pictures very fast, but a number of my PowerPoint montage collections did show that. And again, they showed the capsizing of the Arizona more vividly in the museum at Hiroshima than they did in the museum at Nagasaki. And in reading about these things, I think earlier on they did not necessarily show that, certainly not in Nagasaki. But yes, in each case, they acknowledged the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, the documentation of the Japanese conquest of Pacific China, China is too immense for anybody to completely conquer and occupy, but of the reaches of China within reach of the, I'll call it the Pacific Zone, the total enslavement of Korea, the attacks on Malaysia and Indonesia, and then they euphemistically say, and then we had a southern expansion, and now we were at war with the United States, Britain, the Netherlands, and France.
Were you able to find out why the Nagasaki museums are more negative about the information than Hiroshima?
I do not know that factually. And as Nancy pointed out during our dinner, these are city museums. And I think the city, my guess, I'm not claiming this to be correct, is that they were perhaps more bitter because there was already a predecessor And why did we have to do it a second time? I think it's that take. And as you know, we knew that the radio stations out of Tokyo, from their War Department, from their emperor, should he ever speak, were viable. They were communicating to the British consulate in Hong Kong. So we knew they could receive our messages, surrender now or this is going to keep happening. And from our side of history, we know that those messages were ignored. So Fat Man got used. And maybe that's a sense of their difference in Nagasaki.
I'm curious about your emotions while you were there and the emotions of other tourists that were there. Was it very somber? What was the attitude that people had?
I would say even with groups of school children who were extremely well disciplined and all in uniform, as somber as a group of children might be, they were. The adults were certainly totally somber. The English-speaking people who helped me out in hotels or who I met at Ground Zero and all, I was surprised of the coincidence of their thinking and their take on history, which, right, wrong, or indifferent, is my belief. You know, I believe the decision to drop was done by a very democratic action of civilian and military leaders. A decision was handed to Truman, who had only recently heard of these things. And I've been told that Truman thought, what would they say at my impeachment if it was found that we had spent 1/5 of our war effort on these incredible devices and then I didn't use it to end the war earlier? So that sort of encapsulates my belief. And the visitors with whom I could communicate, or English-speaking hotel managers, or a laundromat operator, and all, I found I couldn't detect a difference from my view back on this history.
Was there any discussion there of the difference in casualties there compared to what it might have been had we had to invade?
No, I did not find that, and that, of course, is a popular follow-on in American history. The estimates, including my father, who was in the Philippines at the time, you know, the estimates in very coarse numbers of 1 million U.S. combatants and 5 million defending Japanese women and children and punjai sticks. And so, you know, that's bandied about. I don't know if that can be given credentials, but we think that we might have spent 1 million lives and they might have spent 5 million. And then you compare that to how many hundreds of thousands of them died in incendiary bombing. But that's sort of a follow-on and not quite what I could capture in what I've shown to you. So I'm making that up after the fact. I didn't learn that there. I knew that ahead of time.
Any more questions? All right, let's finish those.